So welcome to the second installment of Every Genesis Song Ranked. Last video we started at 179, got down to 170, so today we're going to do another 10. If you're not familiar with the series, it's probably a good idea to start with that video and go forward from there. It talks a little bit about the series, about my own personal preferences and assumptions, and about the rules of what we're doing. I'm Hans from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We play smart, dense, melodic music that is honestly pretty influenced by Genesis. So if you're a fan of theirs, check us out on Bandcamp, Spotify, wherever else you find new music. So this is one of a few ballads that kind of mires the first half of Calling All Stations, and I think may cause the overall album to be slightly underrated at least. The other two, of course, would be Not About Us and If That's What You Need, and I put this one right in the middle of those two. So this really just has one musical idea, that repeating dun, 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 that kind of basic motif. It has one lyrical idea, which is being shipwrecked as a metaphor for romantic or social isolation, well, entirely romantic isolation. And pretty much just, wears those two things into a rut without really coming up with much else or doing anything that interesting with either of those ideas. This was actually my favorite song on Calling All Stations back when it came out when I was 13, which in retrospect probably isn't a good sign. If you haven't heard it or you don't remember it, the first half is basically like a reggae song about having acid flashbacks. And in the second half, there's a bunch of kind of spacey synths and a repeated vocoder phrase and a lyric about homesickness that kind of sounds almost like it's improvised or like the vocal melody is improvised. And the whole band builds somewhat to a crescendo, though, not a huge crescendo because the band in that era didn't really have that much of a sense of dynamic, right? So I can't think of any other song that fits the description that I just gave, which is an achievement in and of itself, right? And the song does have an earnest desire to be weird, while at the same time being made by people who are too old and too successful, and I think just too musically conservative to actually be genuinely weird as much as the song seems like it wants to be. And that mismatch, I think, inevitably makes the end result a little bit cringy. If I hear this song in just the right headspace, where I'm in a reasonably good mood, and, I'm maybe a little bit drunk and I'm feeling fairly optimistic, then I can kind of summon up the feelings for it that my teenage self would have had. But on any halfway defensible list, I have to put it pretty low. So I mentioned Shipwrecked a moment ago. This is the third of the ballads in the first half of Calling All Stations. It's the least distinct of the three, I think. As a consequence of that, it's sort of also the least annoying. But it is ultimately a very kind of clean song in terms of sound and arrangement and ideas. Doesn't really ever have much happening. Doesn't really ever give much of a clear sense of what it is about or is not, in spite of giving quite a lot of examples in both categories. It's pleasant, it's unobjectionable, not really too much to praise or to damn about it. I don't want to be too mean to this particular song because it does have a good intention. But if you don't know that it's about Eric Clapton's son, then it just kind of comes across as a particularly bland, sort of mawkish love song. People say a lot of the time that We Can't Dance probably needed editing and resequencing, and this is really one of the songs that makes that most apparent. And in fact, I'd say of all the songs on that album that maybe could have been relegated to B-sides, this is probably the one that drifts the most into being even unlikable. So one interesting quirk of Calling All Stations is there's not a lot of a quality gap in quite a few cases between the album tracks and the B-sides, right? And you could argue maybe that's because some of the album tracks kind of have the feel of B-sides in terms of being similarly undeveloped, but the point stands. Now, the production on this song is really fantastic. There are a lot of little synth kind of flickers, little synth details that they're using to really kind of create a full sense of space in the atmosphere. But even though those help create a really effective sense of 3D space, there's not as much happening from a songwriting standpoint. Now, it does set some time aside for a piano solo that is very fluid and human and just kind of feels a lot more played and a lot more real than some of the other material from these sessions. But the larger instrumental break never quite coheres, which I think might partly be an issue of the drumming, not having a lot of personality. And the melody and lyric in the main section are both just kind of there without distinguishing themselves a lot. So in terms of having really interesting soundscaping and a few intriguing ideas, and then maybe not as much development as it could use in terms of the main portion of the song, this might even be kind of a good microcosm of some of the strengths and failures of Calling All Stations and its related material as a whole. Like everything on Invisible Touch, this song has its fans, it has its supporters, and I respect that. But, the studio version is ultimately just kind of an underwhelming love song, and it comes in between, the most epic song on the album and the most underrated song on the album, both of which will show up a lot higher on this list. The live version really brings this one down, too. The sing-alongs at the beginning were probably entertaining live. On record, they're almost unlistenable. Most of Phil's late period crowd work got edited out of the Way We Walk album. Blessedly, there's no explanation of the domino theory on the audio version, but this is one exception to that. So if you're not familiar with this one, it is the B-side of one of their earliest singles. It's a blues shuffle about somebody who's been charged with catching something called the one-eyed hound. They want him to do it in the daylight, but he knows it'll only work at night. Seems like it might be some kind of a double entendre, something about sexual frustration, though if that metaphor is there, it's very well cloaked, very obscure. There's a little call and response effect going on in the verse that gets very repetitive very quickly. And the mix almost sounds like a demo. This is true of most of the things from this period, but it's very, very easy to imagine this song having been done by smart, ambitious teenagers who don't really have any sense of how to express their own feelings. It's exceptionally odd. It's very entertaining. It's probably not that effective as a song. So this is the B-side to their first single. The verse melody is very pleasant. The lyrics have some really intriguing individual lines that never quite cohere. The chorus is kind of awkward and a little bit annoying, and it's really dominated pretty totally by the pre-fill backing vocals, which are kind of infamous and really mostly never that effective. Overall, it has nice bits. Like I said, the melody in the verse is maybe one of the nicer melodies from this period. There are some interesting lines, but it's not necessarily it doesn't have as much personality. It's not as adorable as a lot of the other early stuff. So Lamb Lies Down on Broadway is kind of a difficult case for this exercise, right? Because I think more than anything else, it has bits which don't really work outside of context and really only make sense within the album. So taken on its own, this is 2 minutes of tremolo guitar and kind of theremin-ish synth whine. There's really nothing about it that you could even call a composition. You have to assume it was inserted to provide space for a costume change, and probably that's why the studio version is 2 minutes 5 seconds. The live version on the archives box is actually only 1 minute 38, right? Probably 1 minute 38 was all of it that they needed in that particular performance. Certainly it doesn't lose anything by being trimmed 25% in length, which really isn't something you could say about maybe any other song on this list, practically. I do feel weird putting a track from Lamb this low, but taking this work as an individual piece in a vacuum, I can't really think of a reason to put it any higher. So if there's any band in the world that probably should not use the phrase old rock and roller, It's probably King Crimson, actually, and then maybe Yes, and then maybe Genesis. But King Crimson and Yes did have the brains not to use that phrase. This does briefly achieve a kind of grandeur the first time that they use the title phrase, put another record on, and the production kind of opens up for a second. There are a few other interesting sonic tricks, but, ultimately it's an undercooked version of an idea that probably didn't ever have that much potential. It's particularly unfortunate because it turns the end of Abacab into kind of a fizzle. All right, so that's number 169 through 160. We're still not really at the part yet where I start saying positive things about the songs, but we'll get there before too long. There just aren't that many Genesis songs that I'm not at least somewhat fond of. So thanks for bearing with me, and I'll see everybody in a couple weeks when we hit number 159.